Ready? Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this late night exchange event hosted by the University of Birmingham. Welcome to everybody in the room. Isn't it lovely to be all back together in a space like this? And welcome to everybody who's watching on the live stream as well at the moment. It's a beautiful new space for the university, this. I think you'll all agree. It is absolutely stunning. I was talking about how I reckon these chairs have never been sat on before. It's always a pleasure to have a bit of new furniture somewhere. But yeah, it's a gorgeous space. It's going to be, of course, a key hub for the university and a really important part of the university's reach out and the kind of way it reaches out to people next year throughout the Commonwealth Games and beyond that as well. So welcome. Just a bit of housekeeping before we go any further. Toilets are, if you come out these doors, straight along to the right end of the corridor. There's some toilets there. There's more downstairs on the ground floor as well. There is going to be an interval, so you are welcome to go back down there as well. And we are not due a fire alarm at all. So if you hear a fire alarm, that means you need to exit the building carefully and safely and calmly. A fire exit there and just over there behind you as well. So this event, I just need to mention two projects that this event is in conjunction with. The Air We Breathe, which is a University of Birmingham project which explores the relationships between air quality, the environment and people through the lens of UOB research, and also the Festival of Social Science. So this is an annual UK-wide festival, and this event is part of that as well. So just wanted to mention those. To introduce myself, I'm Stanczysyzn. I'm a BBC reporter based in Birmingham, and I, as well as many of you, I'm sure, have been following the events up in Glasgow very closely at the 26th UN Conference of the Parties. That's what it stands for. I'm sure you all knew that anyway, but some people don't. 26th UN Conference of the Parties event on climate change. That is what is going on. That's what we've been hearing the headlines from. And of course, it brings countries together politically. It also really puts a lens on the cultural and societal place we're at the moment on climate change and where we're at with the environment. And of course, these are headlines that are reaching all over the world at the moment. So that is why we are doing this. This is an issue we're preoccupied with. And of course, the University of Birmingham is playing its part, a huge part. It has a large amount of very important research that goes on into ways of mitigating climate change and ways of saving the planet and saving our own very existence as well. So tonight we are gathered to hear from some expert voices. They're all expert voices from the University of Birmingham and from elsewhere as well, bringing together the brilliant analysis and expertise that we have in our city, the second city, of course. We'll be hearing from about topics ranging from sustainable agriculture, the role of citizen activism as well in climate change, and also the link between infectious diseases and climate change, something that I know is on lots of people's minds at the moment. And of course, we want this to be a space where you can listen and learn, but also share your views as well with each other during the course of this evening. So this is how it's going to work. We have 8 fantastic speakers for you. There's going to be 4 and then an interval of about half an hour and another 4 after that. In addition to the talks, you'll be able to visit the on-site exhibition. That is, I think it's down on the next floor down, Jeremy, isn't it? The one in the basement, sorry. That's me. I did go, didn't know where I was. It's a new building. So in the basement, you'll be able to go and visit that. And also, you'll be able to take part in some of the activities in that central bar area on the ground floor as well. We hope you are going to engage with and enjoy what you're going to hear tonight. But more than that, feel empowered to talk about this topic, to take it out and to, of course, play your part in this most urgent global of tasks that we are all facing. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker tonight, Dr. Johannes Lawson. Yeah, good. Who is a senior lecturer in economics at the University of Birmingham. He joined the department in 2016, and his research interests lie at the intersection of behavioural economics and environmental economics. So absolutely bang on for what we are talking about. He uses experiments to study voluntary cooperation and pro-environmental behaviour, climate change mitigation. So absolutely where we're at when we're talking about COP26. Please welcome Johannes.
So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for spending your evening at this great venue and listening to me. So, I'm an economist, and you might be thinking, well, what can economists really say about climate change? What questions can they answer? And I would say, slightly provocatively, all the exciting ones, right? So, I hope the talk will be exciting to you. Let's start with an exciting question. So, why do we have to stay below these 2 degrees, right? You have been following COP26, and COP26 is all about staying below 2 degrees. So what would an economist say? Why do we have to stay below 2 degrees? Well, a very boring answer, because the future benefits of staying below 2 degrees is probably higher than the costs of doing so. How do we know that? The most complicated slide I'm going to show you is that one. So how do we know that? So we have basically natural scientists working on climate models. So what they do is they're going to project how greenhouse gas emissions that come basically from 2 sources, agriculture and industry mainly, how will they map into changes of temperature and climate? And they do that via climate models. Climate models have been getting better and better, and we get a clearer picture of what will happen to temperatures and to sea levels and to rain patterns and weather patterns. But these are all things we don't really care that much about, right? We don't care so much about the weather itself. We care about the effects that a change in weather has on our societies. And this is where the economics and the social science comes in, right? We don't care about the 2 degrees per se. We care about what 2 degrees will mean for societies in the future. And this is the hard question. This is a very difficult question, because if you think about the first part of the model, this is a physical model. A physical model is about objects. Objects don't have free will. Objects don't change their minds. Human beings do, and trying to predict what human beings actually will do is a very difficult question. So the second reason why this is a difficult question is because these changes in temperatures and these changes in weather patterns will affect a whole lot of things: health, agriculture, productivity, conflict, cognition, biodiversity, infrastructure. So how do we know what will happen? Well, what we can do is we can look at past data, right? As economists, we like data, and we try to tease out of data some relationships. So what I'm showing to you here is a relationship between daily temperatures and mortality. So this is from a study, not my own study, but from a study summarized in Kathryn and Yang. And what they're trying to do is basically point at a relationship between temperatures and mortality. And what you can take from this graph, if you take one thing, is that in these moderate ranges here, right, nothing much happens to mortality. But if you go to the extremes, then a lot happens to mortality. And this is the basic message, right? We have adapted very well to certain temperatures, and if we move out of these ranges, we suddenly are in trouble, right? So if we go to the very hot temperatures or the very cold temperatures, we are going to be in trouble. And so climate change is going to shift everything into this direction. We're going to end up at this tail of the temperature distribution where it's hotter, and this might mean trouble. Okay. So wait a moment, right? So you might be sitting there and saying, well, we don't care so much about past temperatures, we care about future temperatures, what it's going to do to future societies. This is even a harder question, because we don't know how the future looks like. And before we're trying to show you how we can say something about that, quick question for you. So where do you think will people most likely die from extreme cold? In which places on Earth? So this is a question for you. What do you think? Where is extreme cold most problematic?
In the warmest countries.
Exactly, in the warmest countries. Why is that so? Because the warmest countries are actually least adapted to very cold temperatures. And how do we know stuff like that? And I will just talk about one of these 2 graphs in extent. So we can go to these past data, and then we can try to learn more from them. So this is from a study, and what they're trying to do in this study is basically they're ordering US states from the coldest to the hottest state. So where there's a little 1 here, this is going to be Alaska. Where there's a 10 here, this is going to be, say, Arizona. Yeah? So you have the coldest on the left and the hottest on the right, and what you see in this graph is basically the impact of a very hot day above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, so about 30 degrees Celsius, on mortality. And what you can see from this graph is that on a very hot day in a very cold place in the US, you get a lot of mortality, While from a very hot day in a very hot place in the US, you almost don't get any excess mortality. And why is this so? Because you have adaptation. So human societies can actually adapt to these very hot climates. So this is slightly a positive message about all the other negative messages. This is the positive message, right? We can adapt. You see the same thing on the right-hand graph, right? You have a red line and you have a yellow line. The red line is the far past, going from 1929 to 1959. So very long back in the past, and you get a big U-shaped pattern. Big U-shaped pattern means the extremes mattered a lot, right? You do the same thing for 1960 to 2004, and things look slightly better. And again, why is that so? Because from 1960 to 2004, we had better technologies, air conditioning. People might have changed their occupations, right? They don't work in fields anymore. They work in offices. Offices are air conditioned. And so we can adapt to these things. Okay, wrong conclusion. Are we a little bit too pessimistic about adaptation? Probably yes. Does this mean we don't need to reduce carbon emissions? No, it doesn't mean that. And why doesn't that mean that? Because there are unknown unknowns in all of these things. So the problem with climate change is not so much the stuff we know, but it's the stuff we don't know, right? This is Donald Rumsfeld saying the same thing. So what's the stuff we don't know? So this is a graph basically showing climate sensitivity. This is the key parameter everybody discusses at COP26. So this comes out of a climate model, and it's basically trying to show to you what happens if we double carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then you get something which is called a likely range. It goes from 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would be really good for us, all the way to 4.5 degrees Celsius, which would still be acceptable, right? So this is the likely range of what might happen. So all the problem lies to the right of the likely range, right? This is basically catastrophic climate change. This is the part of the probability distribution we don't want to get into. This is the worrisome bit where we don't know what will happen to human societies. And this is not very likely, right? The likely range is this bit, but it's possible. And there's not a zero probability for that. Probability is much higher than zero, and we have to basically account for these possibilities. So let me conclude with an observation from my own research. An observation from my own research is that the real difficult questions about climate change are normative in nature. And what does this mean? I can't give you the answer to these questions. You can give these answers to yourself. The only role that social scientists can play in these questions is really pointing out what the trade-offs are. So what are the trade-offs? If you think about the next generation and the generation thereafter, there's three things they will inherit from us. One are the climate conditions, the one we are really worried about now, but they will inherit two things more than that: technologies and physical capital, right? So what do I mean by this? Well, the nice research we're doing at the University of Birmingham will inherit some technologies, and physical capital are just factories and possibilities to produce stuff. And there are trade-offs between these things, right? We can lock down the economy to zero, which will leave us with zero physical capital, but will conserve our climate fully. This is one possibility, which is a very extreme possibility, and probably not what the next generation wants. We can ruin the climate and pass on a lot of physical capital, but this is also a problem for the next generation. And finding the trade-offs between these three things is not very easy. So an inconvenient normative question. If climate change stays non-catastrophic, so if we stay in this 1.5 to 4.5 range, then the future generation in all likelihood is richer than the current generation. This is something which is a truism. And what does this mean? Well, if we do a lot about climate change now, we will redistribute money from currently poorer people to people who are richer in the future. Normally we do redistribution the other way around. This is what we are more used to. And so some people might say what we're doing at the moment is insufficiently egalitarian. And this is a little bit inconvenient because this is not how we like to think about this. But if you want to think about climate policies, think about them as insurance policies, and think about them as insurance policies against the second inconvenient normative question: there's irreversibility, right? So if we get these questions wrong and future generations look back at us, there's certain things we can replace. And this is physical capital. Physical capital can be replaced after every war. We have done that so far, right? Things like natural capital that we might also be interested in, right? So if you think about biodiversity as one form of natural capital, then we can replace this only with a lot of future technology. And I want to conclude with two questions, and you can think about them, in the break. So if you think about a child in the future, how much would that child be willing to pay to interact with a real-life polar bear? It's a very difficult to answer question, and here's a little help how you might be thinking about this question. Well, if you think about mammoth, who used to live also on our world, how much would you be willing today to be able to recreate this mammoth? Well, I don't know. I cannot answer these questions, but I can say that these are the sort of questions you should be thinking about if you think about climate policies. So thank you very much for listening to me. Here are some polar bears, and here's my Twitter account if you want to follow me on Twitter or write me an email. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johannes Lawson. Then, really interesting way to start off, I think, asking some of those questions. But we move on to our second speaker of tonight, Professor Christine Foyer. Christine is a leading expert in plant metabolism. Her lab seeks to understand the regulation of plant growth and defence under optimal and stress conditions, with a view to preparing improved crops with sustainable yields for future agriculture. Difficult to imagine a more important thing to talk about at the moment. Welcome, Professor Christine Foyer.
Is everything on there okay? So, could I have the first slide? Do I make it go? No. There we go. So as Kat said, I'm Christine. I work in the Department of Biosciences in the University of Birmingham. And today I'm going to talk to you about forests and their role in mitigation against carbon dioxide increases in the atmosphere as a result of man-made activities. So I think we all have an empathy with forests. Here is an example of a forest. People love usually to walk in trees. People have empathy with trees. You still get people who hug trees. And they are intrinsic to our sense of well-being and our health, so much so that we bring them into our homes at Christmas and we decorate them to bring the nature and the natural world into our homes. And also they're a vital source of timber that we use for multiple purposes. If you look around the room, there's a lot of wood in this room. Do you know how much wood we produce in the UK? Well, we have to import 80% of the wood that we use, the timber that we use. So the forests that we need to produce for the future not only have to be good at storing carbon, but we need to grow them wisely so that we produce our own timber and we don't import it from other countries. So this is the world from space. You can see the greenness of the Earth. The greenness of the Earth comes from the pigment chlorophyll, which is intrinsic to the process of photosynthesis, which is the process which absorbs carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This picture was taken 20 years ago. If you took it now, the Earth would be noticeably greener, because the process of photosynthesis thrives on CO2. Plants thrive on CO2, so the leaf area across the world is greater now than it was 20 years ago. What is photosynthesis? So this is the process by which all plants are able to harvest sunlight, and they use that sunlight to produce energy, and that energy is used to produce carbohydrates and all the other molecules that are in plants and as a result are in us, because all of the food that we eat comes from plants. If you look at the bottom sentence, all the food we eat, the oxygen we breathe, all our fossil fuels, all come from photosynthesis. So sorry, the background has gone on this slide, but I don't think you can see it very well, but it probably is enough. So in photosynthesis, light energy is harvested and it's used to split water. Plants can split water to produce energy. If we could do that, then we would have an endless supply of clean energy. We kind of know how plants do it, but we're unable to mimic it. If we could do it, then we shouldn't worry at all about burning fossil fuels. But the splitting of water is used to produce energy, and there's a bit missing off here, and that energy is used to produce carbohydrates, and those carbohydrates are used to produce biomass, or they are eaten or taken up by other organisms and used again to produce energy and release water. So we have a continuous cycle where photosynthesis is harvesting energy, producing biomass for the use of all other organisms on the planet. So as you probably know, this process of photosynthesis has been going on for millennia. However, the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is recent, and it has to do with industrialization. When I started doing my research in the 1980s, I knew absolutely that the CO2 content of the atmosphere was 340 ppm. I set all my instruments for it. But today, we're nearer 420. So in my experimental lifetime, the atmospheric CO2 has gone up 80 ppm, which is 20% or so, which is quite frightening. So we now have to look how to mitigate and to improve plants to try and take up some of that excess CO2. At present, we have a situation like that, like man-made activities are producing carbon dioxide. About 26% is absorbed by the oceans, about 30% goes into the land, and the rest goes into the atmosphere because the other sinks simply can't absorb it. It's a problem as well because of deforestation across the earth. So the forests, as we said, are enormous sinks for CO2, but there's been large-scale dephosphorylation across the planet. So there's been a big problem in taking away the sinks for CO2. So at the University of Birmingham, there is a facility called the Birmingham Institute for Forest Research, where a large number of researchers are looking at the effects of high CO2 on the productivity of trees. And here you see sites where CO2 is released within a circle. So the trees within each of these circles are receiving a level of CO2 which is 150 ppm above atmosphere, which is what will happen nearer the end of this century. And the people like me working on these sites are measuring everything you can measure about what happens to those trees when they are receiving high CO2. How much can they absorb and what happens? And we certainly know that trees grown with higher CO2 have more photosynthesis, they produce more timber. So the trees benefit from the high CO2. We can look at all of the effects, not just on the trees themselves. So we measure the productivity of the shoots, the timber production, but we also look at the soils because, of course, the CO2 in the atmosphere and what happens to the trees also affects the populations of bacteria and all the organisms that live along the roots. So we understand how the biosphere around the trees is affected by the high CO2. Okay, so we know that trees are good at absorbing CO2. This is my last slide. Here we have the rub. there's the huge push now to plant trees. You'll have seen it on the TV, you'll have seen it, in lots of adverts. But the problem is, we really don't know what to plant. And it's a conundrum. So we know that reforestation works, it's really important. But what do we plant? So it's not easy to know what to plant. So for a long time it's been known that mixtures of species grown to work together work better than individual species in plantations. But we don't know what species work best together. So there's a lot of guesswork. So when you're asked, plant a tree, you want to ask, what am I planting? Where am I planting it? How do you know that's the best place to plant it? And the next sentence is important. Poorly informed tree planting can cause havoc. So it's important to ask those questions. So we need to have diverse forests to maximize carbon capture. But trees in forests are not just for Christmas, they're for life. So if you plant a tree today, you can't forget it. It needs you in 10, 20, 30 years' time to ensure that you maximize its capacity. Thank you, Kathryn.
Some stark information there that I had no idea about. But I mean, the idea as well of the trees benefiting from this extra carbon is really interesting. But it's how we harness that and what that means for sort of future food and things like that. Fascinating. Thank you very much, Christine. Our next speaker is Professor Willem van Schaik. Is that how I say it? Yeah, that's. Yeah. I did check that and I've forgotten it again. But Willem van Schaik, who is a Professor of Microbiology and Infection in the Institute of Microbiology and Infection at Birmingham University. His talk will touch on the link between climate change and infectious disease. Please welcome Professor Willem van Schaik.
Okay, good evening. My name is Willem van Schaik. I'm going to talk about climate change, infectious diseases, and everyone's favorite topic, pandemics. As a microbiologist, I study forms of life that are very, very small. But when I look at Earth, I see a planet of microbes. And the reason for that is that there are 5 times 10 to the power 30 cells on this planet, a 5 with 30 zeros. That's an incredibly large number. And to make this number even larger, there's 10 times more viruses on this planet. We are a planet that's made of microbes. And these microbes have affected our planet in many ways. I'm going to talk today about how microbes have, are affected by climate change. But first, I want to just spend one slide on how microbes actually contribute to climate change. So this is a map of the Arctic region. It's a region which is, of course, known for being very, very cold. And that means that parts of this region are permanently frozen. And what is happening now with the warming planet is that this permafrost is slowly thawing. And that means that the bacteria that are in the soil, for example in Siberia, they are starting to start up their metabolism again. And as an outcome of that metabolism, they produce methane. And methane is the gas that we cook on, but it's also an incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful greenhouse gas. And so by this way, microbes are forming a positive feedback loop by which climate change can speed up with unexpected events like large parts of the permafrost thawing. But I want to talk for the rest of this 5 minutes that I have on how climate change affects microbes and infections. I'm going to talk about how climate change causes drug-resistant microbes to spread faster. I'm going to talk about the danger of insect vectors, and I'm going to talk about how climate change increases the risk of new pathogens jumping from animals to humans and potentially causing new pandemics. So I don't want to talk about how important antibiotics are for modern medicine. We all need it to treat bacterial infections. And one worrying aspect that people have started to realize quite recently, and this is data from an American group, is that higher temperatures mean that you find more antibiotic-resistant bacteria at a certain location. We don't understand, I can be very honest, we don't understand what it is, what is causing this. But we see this in America, and we can also see similar trends in Europe, where countries in the south have more problems with bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics than countries in the north of the continent. So this is already one problem with climate change and a heating planet. Potentially an even bigger issue that we have is a spread of insect vectors. So insects bring, but not all of them, but many insects can be vectors of infectious diseases. So here you see Aedes albopictus, and that's a mosquito that is slowly spreading northwards across Europe. And the reason why it can do that is because the winters are getting warmer, essentially, across the continent. And that means that it can spread more northerly, but it also will spread the potential, the viruses that it can carry with it. And so you can think of diseases like Zika, dengue, yellow fever, chikungunya, that's a very recently emerged disease, that are slowly spreading across Europe. It will be a very long time before they reach Birmingham. But it actually, when you go on holiday to Croatia, maybe Spain, Italy, Greece, those are countries where you start to see these type of diseases now. So this is a development that we are going to see quite soon, or that we are already seeing right now. Finally, I want you to remember one term for my talk, and that's zoonotic spillover. That's the moment where a pathogen goes from an animal host to a human. 70% of all pandemics started with that event, when a bacterium or a virus jumped from an animal to a human. And I have some of the usual suspects there. So influenza, major infectious disease, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, jumped from bats in China to humans. And then other infectious diseases, Zika, Ebola, and HIV, jumped from monkeys and bats and other mammals. And I have bad news for you. This is not the last pandemic, because this is a process that has been going on for millennia. And the problem that we are creating with climate change is that we're changing the global ecosystem. That means that animals basically move out of their original ecosystems and enter new geographies. And that increases the risk of them meeting humans. Also, humans are on the move. We will see climate refugees very soon. And again, when humans are on the move, that also increases the risk of them encountering animals that carry novel viruses and potentially novel bacteria. And so that's another concern that we have when it comes to climate change and infectious diseases. So what can we do about this? First of all, the easy one, we have to minimize global warming. Many people are trying to do that, of course, but that still remains the most important thing that we have to do as humanity. We need to have a global surveillance system for tracking new infections, including those antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And I think that the lessons that we've learned during the COVID-19 pandemic can really help us develop those. And then finally, we need to invest in pandemic preparedness. And no longer we have to go through that terrible time where there wasn't enough PPE in hospitals. We know that there's another pandemic coming. We just don't know what form it will have. And we need to prepare for those coming happening more frequently over the next few decades. And I'm sorry to have to leave you with the depressing thought, but that's why they never invite microbiologists to dinner parties. Thank you very much.
I'm sure that's not true. I'm sure you're great at dinner party. Professor Willem Boonsgate there, thank you very much. and of course extremely relevant to us all at the moment, and has been for a while, but we now, it's in all of our consciousness now, the future of that sort of link between climate change and what it means for future pandemics. Thank you very much. Our final talk for this half of the event, and then we'll have a short interval, is from Mikey Brown, who is the president of the University of Birmingham Guild of Students, the student union, which I remember well from my days there 20 years ago now. Let's not talk about that. But Mikey's here to talk about young people, really, students and young people and activism in terms of climate change. We often talk about climate change as a young person's thing, as something that people are interested in when they are younger, and I think that's a bit of a lazy view sometimes. Of course, all of us, many of us, are interested in this as a topic, but it is the people that are going to be living beyond others that this is going to affect more, and we see those people, of course, often out on the streets and protesting. We've seen a lot of that around COP26 as well. So I'd love to welcome to the stage now Mikey Brown.
Thank you very much. So you've heard tonight from some quite learned scholars and researchers from across the university, microbiologists, biologists, economists. I think in the second half you might be hearing from a professor of finance and historians and a material scientist. And all of them are actively researching on climate change and are probably among the experts in their field. So you might be forgiven slightly for wondering why me as a student, someone who hasn't even got one degree to their name yet, and hasn't even prepared any slides for you tonight, what I might have to contribute to the debate. So fortunately for you, and fortunately for me not being embarrassed for my lack of scientific knowledge, you'll be pleased to know that I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. And as a politics student, and I guess an elected student politician, it will be a slightly more political one. So I recently went up to Glasgow to attend COP26, which is the 16th UN Climate Change Conference of Youth, and it was in the 4 days immediately before COP26 itself. Well, first of all, it was very gratifying to think that me at the age of 31 and as a mature student, I still counted in the eyes of the UN as a young person. That was certainly gratifying and in the view of the organisers of tonight. But seriously, I had the pleasure of meeting young climate change activists from countries really all over the world. I met indigenous peoples from Brazil whose historical homelands are threatened by climate change. And the Bolsonaro government in Brazil ignores the expertise that those indigenous peoples have had in their stewardship of the Amazon rainforest for centuries. I met a young woman from Yemen who told me how flooding had destroyed sites of historical and cultural significance. I met a young lady from the Maldives whose country may simply cease to exist in the coming decades due to rising sea levels. I met young filmmakers from India and Bangladesh who look to capture through art the loss and devastation that climate change has brought to traditional ways of life in the subcontinent. And of course I met young British and Scottish activists from Fridays for Future who weren't having any platitudes from Alok Sharma when he came along to the conference to accept, on behalf of the COP presidency, the global youth statement that was prepared by Youngo, the youth constituency, and I contributed to while I was in Glasgow. They barracked him, they made it clear that they wanted actions from him and not warm words, and then promptly left the auditorium in disgust. I'm telling you about the experience I had in Glasgow for two reasons, really. It has solidified two things in my mind quite starkly. The first of those is that young people just get this. You know, even in countries where there is not formal commitment to environmental education and curricula, young people understand intuitively the scale of the problem that climate change presents for humankind. They won't be cowed into accepting inaction from those in positions of authority, because for them it isn't something they're insulated from. it's something that for many of them is an intrinsic part of their lived experience, and they simply won't tolerate, for that reason, being ignored. I think sometimes it's comparatively easy for us, living and working in Birmingham. We're in relative prosperity here. We're hundreds of miles from the sea. And I think one of the contributors in the second half might have something to say about this, but besides the tornado that ripped through Walsall Heath 15 years ago, we're not famed as being a city that has extreme weather conditions. It's easy for us, I think, sometimes to look at climate change as something that's worthy of sort of a slight clinical or detached scientific inquiry, or we can look at it from a position of dispassionate economic analysis, weighing up the cost benefits. But for the people I met, it's much, much more than that, and they're not taking the status quo lying down. And they reminded me very deeply that whatever transition the world does make away from carbon, it needs to be a just one that does not continue to entrench the inequalities that those in the global south already face. And the second thing it really underscored for me is that the young people of today and tomorrow deserve a great deal more from governments, institutions, and the people who hold financial and political power than they are currently getting. It brought home to me that something has got to change in a system-wide way, and the status quo simply cannot be allowed to remain in place. We're all told to take responsibility for our own situation, our own consumption, to use less gas or water, to reduce our own consumption of meat and dairy. But I think it's only through radical reshaping of our economic and political systems will we get to where we need to be. It was with some horror that I read yesterday that, taken together, lobbyists from the fossil fuel industry comprised a bigger delegation at COP than any country in the world. And they had a bigger delegation than the 8 most at-risk countries, when we're talking about countries at risk of loss and damage due to climate change combined. Those companies have a vested interest in keeping fossil fuel extraction as a going concern as we head towards disaster. As much as many of them will talk about their transition into renewables, or people can talk about investors engaging in those companies to drive changes in those organisations, the production of renewable energy amounted to about 1% of those companies' expenditure last year. They are the past, those companies, and I think we've got all of 7 years at current levels of fossil fuel consumption before our ability to restrict global warming to that magic number of 1.5 degrees runs out. It's finished. So if we were to reach the prosperous zero carbon future that the young people I met in Glasgow demand and deserve, institutional investors need to show true leadership and withdraw their support for the fossil fuel industry. It's clear to me that governments across the world also need to decouple themselves from that industry that has inflicted such monumental environmental degradation on our planet, and leave that practice where it belongs, in the past. As I was putting this speech together for today, I read that Climate Action Tracker predict that even with the new commitments that have been made by governments in COP, we're on track to have global temperatures rise by 2.4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Now I know, the audience here knows, and the delegates in Glasgow all know, that if we were to avoid disaster that is going to imperil lives across the planet, we need to keep global warming well below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. Governments agreed in Paris 5 years ago, 6 years ago now in fact, that they would, that we needed to get to 1.5 degrees and they would take action to get there. So when governments tell us that things are rosy, that the current situation of action and policy will get us to where we need to be, they spread nothing but false hope in my view. They rely on us turning a blind eye as we head towards destruction. Now I can't speak for Alex Sharma, the president of COP. I can't speak for Joe Biden. I can't speak for Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, who didn't even turn up to Glasgow. But from my visit to Glasgow, from my conversations with those activists, and from speaking to the students of Birmingham that I represent, I know that young people of the world will not turn away. They will not turn a blind eye to the destruction that we face. We're wise to the greenwashing tricks of government, industry, and institutions. We will not accept platitudes in lieu of actual change. We demand meaningful, urgent, equitable action, and the youthful world will not rest until we see it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikey Brown, who is the Guild of Students President at the moment, talking about, of course, the fact that we can't talk about this without politics, the symbiosis of politics, as well as science and research and sociology and all the other things that make up what we're talking about tonight. And you'll have more of that after a short interval. You can go and have a break, get a drink, have a wander around, have a look at the exhibition that's in the basement as well. And we'll see you back here at 8:15. Thank you very much.
was just thinking today, being in the space, sort of stuff that you would
Yes, that's all good. Sit down. I'm going to start. Hello, welcome back. Hope you're all feeling suitably refreshed for the second half of this late night exchange event. And my mind's already blown by the amount of stuff I've learnt. I'm going to try and sum some of it up at the end, but it's been really fascinating so far. We've got 4 more speakers now who will be equally as interesting. We're going to talk first actually about behavioural change, which is key if we're talking about climate change. And I know it's something that, again, the news and the headlines have been reporting a lot on. I did my climate bill the other day, the idea of the amount of carbon you use within any given year, and I was utterly shocked as somebody who thinks I'm pretty, I think about things, I recycle, I try not to buy too many, fast fashion clothes. Just the types of things that you think, well, that must be helping, but actually the amount of carbon still came out as quite a lot more than I expected. But just that ability to be able to think about you as an individual and what you're doing, and the idea of individual changes as well, and behavioural changes, is something that I know I've been talking about a lot on my radio show recently as well, and it's interesting to hear people's different takes on what they should or can do. So we're going to talk about that in a second with Dr. Rachel Lilly. I know this is something as well that we talk about, the urgency of climate change. 1 minute to midnight was the Prime Minister's soundbite. Prime Ministers are wont to use soundbites, as I'm sure you know, and that was Boris Johnson's soundbite at the beginning of COP26. I spoke to someone recently who said, we're 5 past already. We're absolutely 5 past midnight. Don't want to terrify anyone, but he's a leading expert in sustainable energy and change, and he said, we are 5 past, but we can still do things. We might be 5 past, but we can make a difference. And that is something that Dr. Rachel Lilly thinks about and talks about. She's a research fellow in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Birmingham. She develops high impact and innovative research in decision making, mindfulness and behavioural insights to support leadership, well-being and behaviour change policy initiatives aimed at improving sustainability and well-being as well. And so please welcome to the stage Dr. Rachel Lilly.
Hello.
That was my old job.
It's in front of me and here.
Yeah, no,
Sorry, Rachel.
that's fine. So yeah, my background is in behavioural science, social sciences, human geography, but I now work here in the Leadership Institute as part of the exchange. So, and it is all really about behaviour change, because it's how do leaders facilitate the kinds of environments where people will do the behaviours, some of which you were discussing there. So I am actually fascinated and done lots of research and lots of thinking around how we create behaviour change. But today I'm going to talk around that related to leadership and how we get the leadership we need to create the change we need. And there was some talk in the last discussion about a need for leadership. Now the thing about climate change is it's something that's I was going to say close to my heart. I'm not quite sure if that's the right expression, but it's something that I personally have been working on for 30 odd years. So here's me, aged somewhere in my 20s, somewhere probably close to some of your ages, as an activist. I was a social activist to start with. I had certain experiences in my childhood that motivated me to try and create social change. And so I was out there being a social activist. I worked on homelessness, various other issues. And then I got involved in the environmental movement, and I started to really see the links between environment and social justice. And I got so much convinced by needing to do something about this and do it urgently, and that was 30 years ago, that I moved to Wales. I joined an environmental project. I lived in a co-op, and I worked in a workers' co-op, and the project was a Centre for Alternative Technology. Some of you may know it. And we had loads of technical solutions at that time. And we also had ideas about how we were going to make this change. And we were fairly hopeful that we would make the change. So as I talk to you now, we now have far more carbon in the atmosphere than we did 30 years ago. And I feel quite touched because my daughter is now close to the age I was then. And there is now more carbon in the atmosphere than there was when I started. So I start to ask myself, you know, what the hell was I doing? What the hell were we doing? What did we get wrong? Well, one of the problems was we were probably not really understanding the problem. And in terms of behaviour change, we thought, naively it turns out, that if you just show someone a graph like this, as some people, we've already seen this graph, I think, earlier on, they'll say, oh my goodness, we better do something. That looks terrible. And if you explain it a bit, then they will act. And this is kind of an information deficit approach. The issue is you don't really have the information. Once you have the information, of course you'll act. But when it's something in the future, you tend not to. When it's a pandemic and it's something now, then you act. But when it's something you can't really envisage, it doesn't quite make sense to you, you don't act. So we didn't really understand that then. And the other thing we thought is, right, we'll tell them what the problem is, and then we'll kind of put up a poster or two. And the poster will tell them why this, obviously, because everybody's really rational, why it makes sense for them to do things like turn lights off. You know, because if you turn the office lights off, then you're going to save loads of energy, which you could use to heat a home. So why wouldn't you? But of course, nobody really reads posters in the way that we thought they might, and nobody would read that amount of information. We're not rational in the way that we assumed sitting in our little eco project. Well, there was eco projects all over the place by then. It wasn't just us. So we got the problem wrong. And what we've learned is the problem looks a lot more like this. It's hugely complicated. It's about every aspect of our life. You know, it's about how we travel, what we eat, and a lot of it's about how we kind of get comfort, you know, how we get ease, how we connect, how we enjoy our lives, because that's what humans do. So it's much more complex. And people's behaviour is a lot more complex than we thought. We don't just, it's not a linear thing. We don't just like see something and then act. It's, you know, we all know this now. And, you know, we have moved on. We've moved on a lot, and we're involving citizens a lot more. So one of the great things that's happened as a result of this kind of development, as a result of understanding we need to involve people, is the citizens' assemblies. And the citizens' assemblies made lots of recommendations. So it was run over, I'm not quite sure how long, but, you know, quite a large group of people. And it came out with a lot of recommendations, and these are two of them that I'm just going to kind of look at, because the Birmingham Leadership Institute, and in terms of creating behaviour change, these two are key. So they called for leadership, which the last speaker also says, you know, we need leadership. We need leadership from government. You know, what are they doing? And we need a joined up approach. We need a more systemic approach. So I'm just going to speak to these for a moment. So, and maybe this is the kind of leadership most of us would love. It's this heroic leadership where we have an expert, we have courage, we have people that can make those difficult decisions and lead us out there, you know, expert hero leaders. That's what most of us want, and in a way that's what is kind of set up. We've got a lot of hierarchy, especially in the public sector, in the government, where the idea is there's somebody who will lead us, an expert, who will get us where we need to be. But that doesn't seem to be happening, does it? Hero leadership doesn't work, and it doesn't work when you've got complexity. Because as much as we might want governments and leaders to make the right decisions. It's almost the amount of complexity that's out there. It's really difficult to do that. And the other thing that we need leaders to do is be able to see the whole of the dance floor, the whole of the system. We have this idea, there's a bit of an analogy we use in what we're calling like adaptive systemic leadership, where we need the kind of leadership where people can step back and see the whole of the system, stand on the balcony, and really work out what's in front of them. And too many leaders just get caught up in a bit of the dance. And they're just focused on some small part, and they're just kind of in the middle of it, and they're dealing with that. Because it's so complex, because there's so much to deal with. So we need leaders who can really hold the whole of a system and find ways using, there's systemic models that can be used, there's ways of engaging people, looking at a problem, diagnosing a problem that enables you to see a system. So we really need that systemic approach. So, and here we've got this idea, this lovely picture here of a team of people really getting that wide view. But the thing that's missing and the thing that needs to be added in here is these people also need to see themselves, because their perception, their biases, their perspectives are also part of the system. So a key thing about a leader is not just that they can see the system out there, but they see the system in here. And a key bit of my research, my PhD research, was working in Welsh Government with directors there. And through that research, it became obvious that they don't really understand what goes on in here, despite the fact that most of their job is spent using their minds, talking to people, dealing with conflict, dealing with emotion, negotiating, taking on board multiple bits of information during the day and trying to deal with all that information with lots of other people. Now that's about cognition, it's about perception. And most of our leaders have got no idea how that works. But we've got more and more idea how that works. Social science, neuroscience has got a lot more to say about how that works. So we need leaders who use that science, build their self-awareness, understand how their own sense-making works. So we don't need hero leaders. We don't need so many hero leaders. We need leaders who can see systemically, who can work in systemic ways, using models, using facilitation exercise, participatory ways of working. We need them to be able to stand back and see the whole system, and also to understand themselves and their part in the system and how their biases are influencing the system. Those are the leaders we need, and they won't come naturally. They need training, they need support, there needs to be some input to get those leaders to that place. But here's the thing, we're all part of systems. Everybody is in an organisation, a family, a friendship group. We're in a little system now that's kind of come together to do the talks and the work that we're doing now. We're all part of systems. So we can all be systems leaders, and we can all take a step back, look at what biases we're bringing, look at the system, and see what we can do within that system to change it. And I'll take for an example, and there was some I think someone mentioned, well, it's not about us as individuals. Or is it about us as individuals? There's a bit, people aren't quite sure really, because there's this idea that small acts, well, if I do that, what difference is that going to make if I use a reusable cup or don't use a reusable cup? Because they're thinking it as that one behaviour on its own. But we work as a system. We're really influenced by social norms. That's what Instagram is all about, influencing. So some research in Birmingham, not by me, by someone else, showed that in terms of the use of reusable cups, the thing that's most likely to get you to use reusable cups is seeing other people use reusable cups. So use reusable cups so others see you, tell them they see you, use reusable bags, wear clothes that are second-hand, tell people this was from a charity shop in Aberystwyth at the weekend, that you're using them. and it will influence other people. Be systems leaders. Oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. So all of you can be systems leaders. And one thing I have learned, if you're going to do, I've been doing this for 30 odd years, is you need to enjoy it, because we're in for the long term. And also you need to enjoy it because that's how you're going to bring other people along with it. We need to kind of create a life that we actually want to live, and it needs to be fun, and it needs to acknowledge that as human beings, we like having pleasure and we like having fun. So climate change has to have that in it. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
Dr. Rachel Lilly, I think we can all get on board with some of that, not just the enjoying your life, but how suggestible we are as well. It's sort of obvious when you think about it, but it's something that, again, haven't seen it in that context before of you using something, other people follow you. Thank you to Dr. Rachel Lilly. We are next going to hear from Dr. Gavin Harper. Now, Gavin is a research fellow at the University of Birmingham. His research currently is on the circular economy of technology metals, with a particular focus on the recycling of automotive components in electronic vehicles. Now, this is something we haven't mentioned yet, but of course is hugely important to the West Midlands. We hear our politicians talk a lot about the electrical vehicle industry here, how the West Midlands can be a leader in that. We know that we have courses such as in the College of Wolverhampton. I did a really interesting interview with some of the young people there that are working on the EV mechanical course, and it's the first one, I believe, in the country, where they will be learning how to be the mechanics of electric vehicles. Again, something that I sort of thought, well, that must have been happening for ages, and it hasn't been. It's only just started. So these are the sort of innovative structures that we are seeing here in the West Midlands, and I'm sure Dr. Gavin Harper is going to tell you a lot more about that now. Dr. Gavin Harper.
Thank you very much. So let's just pick up on that. The West Midlands and jobs for electric vehicles. Now, the Faraday Institution estimate that we're going to need 8 gigafactories to produce the quantity of electric vehicle batteries that we need to power us into a clean and sustainable future in the run-up to 2040. And they say that if we build all of those factories and produce all of those batteries in the UK, we'll have somewhere between 186 to 246,000 new jobs in battery manufacturing and automotive. So there's a great abundance of opportunity there. But there's also a challenge, because if we fail to build that capacity, and if we fail to invest in the industries of the future, there's also a risk, and we're no stranger in the West Midlands to the loss of automotive jobs. And there's the potential for the loss of 114,000 high-skilled jobs by 2040 if we don't invest in that infrastructure. But there's a challenge, because obviously to achieve this transition, we're going to need the materials to build the new technologies of the future to replace the old technologies of the past. Now, by 2040, if the International Energy Agency's predictions on electric vehicle uptake are correct, the waste arising from the batteries of electric vehicles produced up to 2040 would form a pyramid 1.5 times the size of the Great Pyramid in Giza. So that's an enormous amount of material that we need to find in the first place to produce those batteries. But it's also an enormous opportunity to harness that waste, recycle it, and produce new technology in the future. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the critical materials that are going to underpin future energy technologies. Now, what do we mean by a critical material? It's a term that not everyone's familiar with. There are some materials that are incredibly economically important, and obviously that changes because the materials that we use in our economy are changing over time as new technologies come on stream and new applications are dreamt up. But it's those materials that are economically important but also at risk of short supply. And there's a lot of reasons why we might have challenges with material supply. It could be that those materials aren't particularly abundant, that we just don't have access to them in the UK, they aren't in the ground, that we have political instability in the countries that we do source them from, or perhaps we're not on particularly friendly terms with the countries that control the monopoly of those materials. It's also about the processing capacity for those materials. So if you dig it out of the ground, you need to do an intermediate operation to produce a useful material to put into a technology product. So all these factors can create supply risk around different critical materials. And these are important for future technology applications. And if you look around the world, there are some hotspots around certain materials where we have particular vulnerabilities. So I was talking to you about electric vehicle batteries. Current battery technologies are very reliant on cobalt, which provides the high energy density that gives you great power and the long range that consumers expect, because people want their electric vehicle to have many of the same properties as their internal combustion engine vehicles, with a nice long range and good driving performance. But the problem is that 60% of the world's cobalt supply comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Not all of it is produced in ethical conditions. So there are problems with child labour, there are problems with human rights abuses, with health and safety around the extraction of that material. And so understandably, car manufacturers are squeamish about associating themselves with unethical practices. The other challenge is it's not just about where the material is located in the ground, it's also about the processing capacity for that material. And China has been very proactive. Obviously their economy works in a very different way from ours, but they've proactively invested in that processing capability to turn that cobalt into battery materials. And there's a company called Benchmark Minerals Intelligence that track the gigafactories that are being built around the world. And I think they've set out of something like 200 gigafactories that they're tracking to the year 2030 that are being built. 166 of them are in China. And in the UK at the moment, we're really struggling to get our act together building the first factory, but we need 8 by 2040 if we're to compete. So it's about where the materials are located, where the processing capacity is located. Another thing is rare earth magnets. So those super strong magnets, you sometimes get them in Christmas presents and, sort of little toys with these magnets that have got enormous force. They're used in offshore wind turbines, they're used in electric vehicles. And that real strength is the unique property that they impart to the technology products that they're within. So they enable us to produce offshore wind turbines that don't have gearboxes, because obviously if you're going to put something out on a pole in the middle of the North Sea, you want it to be as reliable as possible and with a minimum of user serviceable parts, so you don't have to keep going out to the sea to service it. And in electric vehicles, they produce the most efficient high-performance electric vehicle motors. And I think it's 86% of the world's rare earth supply currently comes from China. So we need to think about how can we diversify our supply and access to these materials if Britain wants to compete. And so over time, if you think about the evolution of technology, the amount of materials that are being used in our technology is growing more and more. More materials, more complex technology products. And so we're reliant on a much wider range of not just sort of raw materials, but niche materials. If you think about old vehicles, internal combustion engine vehicles, very simple materials, pressed steel bodywork, iron in the engine, sometimes aluminium, maybe some rare elements are used in producing high performance alloys in certain bits, but nothing particularly special. If you think about electric vehicles, you need rare earth elements for the motors, you need battery materials, you need materials for the LEDs, a much wider range of elements. So as we move towards a greener technology future, we need access to a wider range of niche elements to power those technologies. And just to give you a summary of some of the different applications where critical materials are going to be important in the future, we're thinking about hydrogen and fuel cells. In Birmingham, in the city of Birmingham, we've now got fuel cell buses that run between the airport and the city centre, and they've got PEM fuel cells in that have got platinum group metals. We've also got electrolyser materials that are used to produce green hydrogen from renewable energy. If you think about flight at the moment, there's materials like rhenium that are used in superalloys for producing high-performance aircraft engines that are more efficient than previous engines. Obviously, we need to be really cautious about the amount of flying that we do into the future and think about reducing carbon emissions by behaviour change. But we also need to think about, for the flight that we need to do in the future, how can we deliver that in a more efficient way? And companies are looking at the hybridisation of flight, which will use things like samarium cobalt magnets in future aircraft engines to produce hybrid engines. So new materials going into that application there. Battery materials will be used in everything from portable electronic devices to electric vehicles to large-scale stationary energy storage. Platinum group metals again will be used in pharmaceutical applications in catalysts. So we need to think about, as a nation, how are we going to secure access to these materials? And so the University of Birmingham worked with Sir John Beddington, who was a former Chief Government Scientific Advisor, to produce a report, Securing Technology Metals for Britain, that looked at how Britain, as a nation, post-Brexit, after leaving the EU, should formulate a new independent strategy around critical materials sourcing to ensure that Britain retains competitive advantage in high-tech manufacturing and all of these new industries of the future. But there's a bit of a risk and a bit of a caveat, because obviously we look at things from our own perspective, and obviously Britain is having a moment at the moment where it is thinking about, post-Brexit, how can we ensure that our industry remains competitive? How can we ensure that we secure access to these materials to keep jobs, to keep productivity in the UK? But actually thinking about the climate and thinking about the nature of the challenge in the future, it's not just about us succeeding. We need everyone to be really good at securing access to critical materials, because these are the materials that are going to underpin the future energy transition. And that's why at Birmingham we're looking at techniques like how you can recycle rare earth magnets from old hard disk drives and turn them into magnets that can be used in future electric vehicles. We're looking at how you can take old batteries that have come out of electric vehicles and put them into a new second life application in the power grid. We're looking at more advanced technologies for how you can take old electric vehicle batteries and turn them into new ones. And with approaches like these, by reducing the amount of critical materials in products, by substituting them for other less critical materials, by looking at how to retain those materials within a circular economy, and by looking at how we legislate and regulate these materials, we hope that we can devise some challenges to the challenge of materials criticality that will enable us to transition into a clean energy future. Thanks for your time.
The ultimate recycling in many ways, of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Gavin Harper. Fascinating stuff there. We're going to move on now to Professor Hisham Farag. Now, Mikey touched, I know, on the idea of vested interest and of big business, and some of the lip service maybe that's paid without some of the actual putting the money where the mouth is. However, we know up at COP26 in Glasgow that there's been a huge amount of interest from big business there as well. It's not just political leaders and experts and scientists, it's big business that are very much wanting to be part of this conversation, and realistically who need to be as well because of the world that we live in. Professor Hisham Farag is a Professor of Finance and Director of Research at Birmingham Business School. He is also the founding director of the Sustainable Financial Innovation Research Centre. So he is the perfect person to talk about this. Please welcome Professor Hisham Farag.
Good evening, everybody. Actually, we are going to talk about finance. So we're going to change the topic. So finance is the topic, I think, maybe interest of everyone here. So before I talk about finance and how this may link to climate change, we all talk about the energy consumption and the world energy consumption. And we give you some complicated figures, and I would like you to imagine the world energy consumption as if as simple as equivalent to the power of 27 light bulbs for how many years? Guess. Around 14 billion years. This is the world energy consumption. And not only that, the new technology of the new generation, fintech and cryptocurrencies, this actually add significant amount of energy consumption and to the equivalent to level of the entire nations. So what we found that the energy consumption of Bitcoin, for instance, is probably more than the energy consumption annually for some countries like Norway and Argentina. So this is quite concerning. And you may think about which country is coming from this mining, or 75% of mining of cryptocurrencies is found in one of the countries. Guess which country is that? Yes. Is it China? China. 75% of mining cryptocurrencies is found in China. Okay, so now we can imagine the energy consumption. And this has led to what? We are probably familiar with this diagram and the massive increase in carbon dioxide, which is CO2. And can you see that's 65%? Okay? We all understand the top polluters, top 4 countries, probably producing more CO2 than others. 56% of CO2 emission coming from 4 countries. Do you know what are those countries? China, US, India, and Russia. And this is quite clear. The rest of the world, only 4 countries produce 56%, and the rest of the world, including the UK, is 44%. So this has led to what? This has led to significant, probably, as you can see, typhoon and wildfire and all environmental disasters we could imagine. This is due to the massive increase of emission of CO2. Okay? From the finance perspective, there is the economic impact. What is the economic and financial impact of this? First, the funding bodies or banks, they're going to look at any funding application. They're going to scrutinize funding application going forward. They're going to look at something called transition risk, climate change risk, or any physical risk related to climate change. And what is the consequence of that? The cost of capital or cost of funding is going to be higher for most of businesses. And who's going to be hit the hardest? SMEs. And you may know that SMEs is the backbone of the UK economy. And one piece of information probably may surprise you, that only 10% of our SMEs are able to measure their climate risk. So there is a clear concern here. Definitely the sea level rise may impact some countries, or some cities will disappear. 6 feet rise in the sea level may impact around 2 million houses with market value around $880 billion. This is significant. And also house prices. House prices will be probably higher, and we can see that. Houses are exposed to probably climate risk. They are sold at 7% on average lower price. The estimated cost of climate change is massive, around $390 billion. So where does the money come from? Where is it coming from? That's why we always say we need to bridge the gap and we need climate finance. And climate finance, the diagram in front of you, it shows that probably the development of climate finance before COVID. And probably we might be really happy to see it hits the mark of $500 billion probably in 2018, 2019. This is not really significant. This is drop in the ocean. Do you know why? Because a recent report by one of the institutions responsible for banking industry and financial institutions, they reported that during 5 years post-Paris Accord, the amount of money invested in fossil fuel projects is about $3.8 trillion. And this is fact. So when we talk about $500,000, this is really drop in the ocean. And we can name, those are the top 15 financial institutions investing heavily in fossil fuel-based projects. So what could be done here? Financial innovation is really key in order to bridge the gap. So we recently start to hear about green bonds, green and blue bonds, and social responsibility bonds, and many other technology or probably innovation in finance. All of these types of bonds, the proceeds of these bonds directed to, say, green innovation, cleaning the oceans, and so on. We need more of this. And the good news about green finance is stock markets react positively to any issuance of green bonds. Stock market reacts positively, really great. But there is also a bit of bad news here I'm going to talk in a minute. When you look at the development of the green bonds over the past few years, we can see just the cumulative value is around $1.1 trillion. This is great, but we need more. As I mentioned, stock market reacts positively. But there is a problem here, which is I'm just trying to make it simple. The rate of return on those bonds, compared with the normal bonds, they are probably lower. So just the investor would say, why should I invest in green bonds that offers me lower yield? And just I would prefer to invest in regular bonds, whatever the proceeds are going to. So it would be much better for me. Also, the good news is we hear about ESG, which is environment, social, and governance. So all of the ESG fund, which is now accounts for 1/3 of all of the asset under management. This is great as well. However, we need more to raise awareness of financial professionals, raise awareness of most of the stakeholders. Some countries are doing really great initiatives, like the UK. We hear about the green finance strategy. We hear about the infrastructure bank. We hear about the task force that's trying to make the disclosure mandatory as soon as possible. But there is a resistance by companies, by the way, on this. We hear about the sovereign green bonds and other initiatives. However, for the same time, we hear from the media and the reports that we can hear that just probably water companies discharge sewage in our rivers. So this is really concerning. Is that right? We also hear about the initial go-ahead for the new coal mine in Cumbria, and probably the new license for oil and gas exploration. So which direction we are going for? How about the rest of the world? The rest of the world actually even concerning. When we hear about the decision by the Japanese government to release about 1.2 million tons of radioactive contaminated water into Pacific Ocean, this is really concerning. When we hear about the top polluters like India and China, they said we're going to reach net zero in 2060 or 2070 in 50 years' time, and there is no guarantee. This is quite concerning for everyone. Not for us, for the coming generations, actually. America, the second top polluter, actually, problem here is the political landscape may impact any commitments. As we understand what happened with the Paris Accord, and then after the President Biden, and we can see. In Russia, probably the fourth top emitter, they just were asking why Why 2050? Is it a magic number? So there is a clear concern from the international community how we take that serious, actually. Okay, who's going to be hit the hardest? Countries that actually has nothing to do with CO2 emission. Developing countries will be hit the hardest, and they actually hit hardest at the moment. And we see that some countries or some cities will disappear. So there is a moral obligation. Even if when we talk about the finance pledge during Paris Accord, in which we promised developing countries to provide around $100 billion every year, this has not been met yet. So there is, again, this is clear concern about it. What we can hear some probably regulators and some government whispering is not really clear in the media so far, which is the unintended consequences of climate change, such as what? I'll give you a few examples. One of them is the energy sector is really massive. I'll just give you an example of the biggest 10 energy companies. The market value of those companies is about $2.2 trillion. If everyone is excluding energy sector from portfolios, this may lead to what we call in finance stranded assets. And stranded assets in such big sector like energy may cause even bigger financial problems, which we call it systemic risk. So they are trying their best in order not to hit hard this sector because of its substantial size in the financial markets. And what else? We heard about the carbon pricing, and the governor of the Bank of England just recently, he mentioned that companies must be prepared to pay almost around $100 per ton of CO2. What is the consequence of that? The consequence is the cost of capital or the cost of fund of those companies will be higher. And again, this leads to what? This leads to lower market value for most of the companies. So again, this is unintended consequences, trying to avoid that. How? The other thing is the knock-on effect, and this is recent report by the Treasury. They mentioned the revolution in the electric car. They may lead to a massive black hole in finance. How much is that? $37 billion pounds because of the tax. So where are they going to deal with that? So these are just some probably examples of the unintended consequences that they are whispering, not really loud. So can we, what could we do? Are we going to keep silent? We can't. Research is saying that innovation is the way forward. But the problem with innovation is it is not the problem of one nation. It is a collective action from international community. And I'll give you an example. The UK Research and Development Fund is around 22 billion pounds a year. Compared with the European Union, they allocated around 26 billion pounds for basic science and 53 billion pounds for applied science. Much bigger. What if those countries and main countries, they came together and form alliances, or we have what is called Research and Development R&D International Fund. To do what? To do creative or some innovations, something like carbon capture storage. We hear about that. This is still a very expensive technology, but the more we invest in that, the sooner we will get better outcome. We hear about smart city initiatives. We hear about the sensors to map the air pollution everywhere. We need to get that as soon as possible. And my final words to conclude is what we need is political will. This is really important. Not talk. We need actions on the ground. And also climate justice for emerging and developing markets. And finally is the financial innovation. A key example I heard about from a Norwegian company. They use the new technology, which is in finance, which is token. So probably the traditional finance we are hearing now, shares and bonds will disappear very soon. In 10 years' time, everything will be like tokens. So they encourage younger generation by providing tokens in order to clean oceans and seas. And this exercise was really very successful in Norway. So we need something like that. So financial innovation is one key, and thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you, Professor Hisham Farag, everybody, and that idea of incentivizing people to actually make big changes is an interesting one as well. So we're on to our final speaker, and a bit different, not an academic, well, an academic of types, right? But yeah, you're. But well, you're a teacher, so I'm going to count that. But Liz Coleman is a teacher. She specialises in special educational needs in the primary sector. But Liz is also the co-chair of Citizens UK, and we've talked a little bit already. I think Rachel was talking about collectivism and the idea of citizens' assemblies and the idea of what you can do. Well, Liz knows all about that because Citizens UK is an independent membership alliance of faith, education, trade union and community institutions acting together for the common good of Birmingham. And Liz is going to talk a little bit about what Citizens UK and the sort of movement that she's part of can do to help tackle climate change. Liz Coleman.
Thank you very much, that's great. And really good to have the last slot as well tonight. We've heard so many different things, and I'm really pleased to see that kids want climate justice, because that's really close to my heart. Okay, so I'm Liz Coleman, as you've heard, and we're going to talk about community organising, hopefully. There we go, it's me. So community organising is about returning power to the people. Citizens UK helps its 570 member institutions across 15 towns and cities in the UK to develop leaders, school children, teachers, teaching assistants, university lecturers, ministers of religion, all sorts of leaders. Leaders come from everywhere, they can be every age. The reason we develop leaders is so that they can participate in public life, holding politicians and other decision makers to account on the issues that matter to them. We prioritise personal relationships and the membership of institutions that are related, that are really rooted within the communities. We have some diaspora communities across the city in membership as well that are really important to us. And together, across our diverse association, we organise to influence people who hold power in government, business and in public life. Our members are from a diverse range of institutions, including schools, universities, churches, mosques, synagogues, parents' groups, health practices, charities, community businesses, trade unions, and even a gym. The University of Birmingham has been one of our principal partners since 2015. To give you a short idea of the whole of the range of things that we do, we've got a short video which we prepared, and it shows our work from 2013.
This is the story of civil society building power to win change. Founded in 2013, we are a non-partisan organisation of member faith, education, trade union, enterprise and community institutions. We do not support any political party, but we take voting and democracy seriously. We are citizens from diverse communities acting together for the common good. Our mission is to build the capacity of people to act on what matters to their families and institutions through community organising, and in the process develop leaders. In 2014, we persuaded NHS commissioners to ensure 16 and 17-year-olds for the first time were given access to specialist mental health services.
The answer to both of your questions is yes.
In our neighbourhoods, our schools persuaded shops and businesses near them to act as safe havens to make local streets safer.
That's great.
In 2015, we launched a national campaign to resettle Syrian refugees from UN camps, persuading Birmingham City Council to welcome 50 people, and congratulated employers in the region for paying the real living wage. In 2016, we secured terminally housing surgeries in our member primary schools. Birmingham City Council pledged to resettle a further 500 Syrian refugees. The Police Commissioner and the West Midlands Fire Service became living wage employers. In 2017, we held our region's largest ever civil society assembly when 968 people set out priorities for a relationship with our first ever regional mayor. In 2018, we celebrated news of the Commonwealth Games coming to our region, launching a set of citizens' guarantees. So those in charge ensure the Games directly benefit local communities. We also welcomed the first refugee family resettled through community sponsorship in our region. In 2019, we ran our most extensive listening campaign, going deeper on the stories and issues facing our membership while stepping up our leadership training. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic struck with the tragedy of over 10,000 people in our region losing their lives to the virus. We never imagined we'd be community organising to stop people dying. As we saw the rise of hate crime and fake news, keeping communities informed of the facts, supporting families directly, and hosting vaccine hubs were just some of the ways our members took action. In a nutshell, since 2013, through the habit of training leaders, taking public action, and building accountable relationships with those in power, we strive to make our families better off, communities safer, and the West Midlands a region of welcome. Focusing on the world as it is to achieve the world as it should be.
My job is to make college easier because students have a lot of
I don't know where she's come from.
plates. Like Harper, an econ major who piles on the pressure. Grammarly can help her stress less.
Thank you. Didn't happen in the run through. Okay. So you can see that flavour of the work that we've done since 2013. And we think that our work on community organising for social justice is integral to progressing climate justice in our city. Our member institutions serve some of the communities and some of the poorer parts of the city affected by low pay, terrible housing, high rates of crime and pollution. Some of my colleagues earlier have shown us that the research that shows that low-income families, both overseas and here in Birmingham, are the people that have been hardest hit, and often they're most least responsible. I love Birmingham. I came here for a year to do my teacher training in the 90s, and I've stayed here ever since. But 42% of children in Birmingham live in poverty. 42%. The past and the present are littered with injustices, but the future doesn't have to be. Mikey Brown from the Guild of Students has challenged us already on this, and we want to work together. We're focused on pushing the policymakers, the researchers and the investors in our city about being clear who benefits from their work and who is being left behind. Wonderful picture there. So you've got that amazing, fantastic new square that we've got, cost over £1 million, really, really good, love it. And right next to it, also in the clean air zone, is St George's Park in Newtown, also in the clean air zone, a 15-minute walk from here. And for a fun day in the summer, that was a Commonwealth Games fun day, it took the police and volunteers a day to make that park clean and safe for the families to go and play in it. and that's a green space in the heart of our city. We need our green spaces. We know that. We need safe places for children to play. And I spoke to a mum who said, I never come out here because it just feels so unsafe for me. And she backed to her house, backed onto that park. That's one of the challenges that we're facing. So let's look at civic leadership. The University of Birmingham is a world-class institution, and it draws significant relationships with the statutory bodies of the city: Birmingham City Council, the Combined Authority, the private sector, Chamber of Commerce and business. What we believe is it must do more to build its connection to civil society, perhaps through its relationship with Citizens UK, beyond the habit of individual researchers who work with us on some projects, to that of it being a whole organisational culture. Rachel has stressed the importance about involving citizens, and we really need to do that to bring about real change. If the private sector is where the businesses are, and the statutory sector is where the politicians and the policymakers are, then civil society is where you'll find the people and their families. And that's us at that day there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz, and a really important message to end on. So, Glasgow might be at the heart of what we're finding out at the moment at COP26, at the heart of knowledge and debate around tackling climate change. But I think we've had the most incredible vision actually tonight of the intersectionality of some of the world-leading research and thought that is happening right here in Birmingham, a place that we all care very, very much about. And the knowledge, of course, that will help shape policies and attitudes and ultimately the future of the planet and of our species as well. I've learned so much tonight. I'm hoping you have as well. It's been absolutely incredible. The fact that carbon has gone up to 420 ppm just in the last 30 years, that's about a 20% rise. I did not realise it was that much. That was quite shocking to me. The idea of zoonotic spillover, that's one thing I'm going to remember from tonight, and the idea that climate change is bringing about the possibility of more pandemics. That's a scary thought as well. The greenwashing of governments and the idea of lip service and how voices have to be strong around this and make sure that we're holding to account. Behaviour change, information deficit, that it's not as simple as that. Obviously, it's a very complex picture, and how we can all be systems leaders. Critical material, the future technology of EV and where those materials are located and the complexity around that and the importance that people are talking to each other, governments are talking to each other about that. The idea of sustainable financial practice, green bonds, and avoiding unintended consequences, which again is something, it's a very big complex picture, and how you can't uncouple social justice. That's, I think, one of the big messages as well. You can't uncouple social justice from progress on climate change. And lastly, what I'd pay for a woolly mammoth to come back. That was something I'm going to go home thinking about now as well, and I hope you will as well. Thank you very, very much for your attention tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hope you've enjoyed it, and good night. Thank you very much.